because injustice exists. And by not talking about race, what we're deciding to do is to ignore injustice.
If you're not willing to acknowledge and name a problem, then you can't address it. And we need to acknowledge and name the fact that we have a race problem in America.
Race is important to talk about right now so that we can start healing and we can start moving forward and start coming together as a human race.
So many reasons. Race, although it is understood as almost purely a social construction, serves as a basis for how we think about ourselves, how people have been defined, how spaces have been limited, or how spaces have, or how people have been allowed to exist in space and time in the United States.
And while there's been progress over the last 400 years, the symptoms of that continue to manifest themselves. And we need to be okay with naming that and calling it, because you can't start to address a problem unless you're willing to admit and acknowledge that one exists.
It's important to talk about race because we need to have those conversations, right? We need to have conversations about who we are, and there's so much that is connected with race, right? It's not just race, but there's like ethnicity and culture and traditions, and there's so much that kind of connects with that, either directly or indirectly. And so it's important to have these conversations just because it's a way for us to understand one another, to get to know our neighbors, and really kind of break down any stereotypes or judgments that we might have against other community members.
Well, so I would say that there's like two parts to this. One is just the part that exists for being Asian and growing up in America, particularly in a predominantly white suburban neighborhood, and that effect that it had on me personally. And then there's just what I do now, is the impact that it has on my day-to-day work.
Race is always an important topic to talk about, and especially this year with so much tension arising because of Black Lives Matter and the anti-Asian sentiment during the COVID pandemic. Race is at the top of the list in terms of things to discuss and deal with.
And so the conversations of race are important to me in this community, in this population, because throughout my whole history of living in the city of Detroit, it seems to be a black and white conversation all the time.
In 2020-21, we're in a pandemic, and in a pandemic, that means that we have to look at a difference in the number of people who get COVID-19 and the number of people who die from COVID-19. And there's an injustice there. When you look at healthcare, when you look at education, when you look at housing, when you look at poverty, when you look at incarceration rates, when you even look at climate equity, there are racial differences, not just here, but across the world. And so I think that we cannot, because race is not interpersonal, it is interpersonal, but it's beyond it, it's structural.
It's important to talk about race so that we can ultimately move humanity to the real conversation, which is about culture. That's the constructive one. Race is the fake construct that was systemically built for a systemic purpose. Therefore, it needs to be systemically taken down. And race is the divider. Culture is the thing that unites us and gives us an appreciation of one another from a human level. And that's why it's important to talk about race, so we can identify it and really eradicate it, but generationally so. And that way we can get back to having conversations that actually edify societies.
The criminalization of poverty and that intersection of over-policing of Black and brown folks. And what's crazy about that is that I can say criminalization of poverty, no problem, everybody's cool with it in terms of understanding the problem. The second I bring in the idea of race, the component of race that comes attached with the over-policing of Black communities for these crimes of poverty, or the harsher sentences that happen because of that, or the cascading effect of these offenses, game over. I can't talk about, for example, how it's harder for a Black person with a warrant to get a job than it is for a white person to get a warrant, with a warrant to get a job, because it's twice as hard for a Black person in that scenario. But I can't talk about it. I can't bring it up in court because I'll get shot down because the white judge won't understand it. And so, but it's important, it's happening, but it's one of those conversations in this context, I can't even talk about it because it closes the door.
Racism is rooted in a belief system that some people are better than others. And sometimes it's, unconscious, and sometimes it's quite conscious. This belief system that some people are more moral, some people are healthier, some people are better people.
As a Black man in America with a doctorate degree, oftentimes I'm not viewed as a scholar. That is challenging because I went through the same rigor as other people, but when I step in the room, my credentials are questioned, even though they came from the University of Michigan. In the space that I work in higher ed, when I think about racism, I'm the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in the College of Ed, Teacher Ed Division, and it's a field that's dominated by women, white women. And when we get into leadership, you don't see many people that look like me. So those people are making decisions when it comes to curriculum, as well as instruction in systems that people like me are a part of. More specifically, if we were to look at the city of Detroit, where over 86%, or 81 to 86% of the population is Black. We're not represented in the leadership ranks.
What does it mean to be a white person in a place of employment versus a person of color, and what opportunities or lack of opportunities might come with that? And when you can understand the internal aspect of race and your own identity, and then how it shows up in the world immediately around you, then you can start to understand how race permeates our systems throughout our country. The role that race plays in things like our criminal justice system, or our healthcare industry, or our education system. And you can start to understand the systemic nature of race and racism.
Even me, articulate as I may be, well-spoken though I may be, mature as I may be, can go to some places in this society and still be seen as an N-word. That's cliche, but it's painfully true. And it's because I'm fighting centuries of subjugation on every level of society that trickles from government to policy to corporations to business to the homes, and is passed across dinner tables.
I think as a white man who grew up in the Detroit area but not in the city, outside of the city, I've had it's been a learning journey for me throughout my life and my career. I didn't understand the privileges that were afforded to me as a white man growing up. I think that's hard for a kid to understand, right? It wasn't until maybe college where I started to get kind of an academic understanding of inequity and systems and structures of power, and learning more about the history of our country, where I started to, I think, intellectually understand that, as a white man, I've been afforded certain privileges.
And I'm always fighting for position highly of the people that I work with and for. Not just Black men, but Black women, brown men and brown women, red men and red women. It's like these racialized perceptions of what we can't do, and when we show up and show out, that can't be. And we're the anomaly. No, there are more of us. You're just not opening up the doors for us to participate in the conversation. And when you do open up the doors, you want us to speak a certain way, look a certain way, and have a certain tonality when we deliver our presentations. And don't let me come across too forceful. So I have to temper my delivery, because if I don't temper my delivery or even firm up my look, there's a perception that I'm coming across too aggressive. So I'm always on guard. So from the moment that I wake up to the time that I sit at my computer, to the time I have to connect in meetings, I'm always figuring out this, not figuring out, I'm playing mental jujitsu on how to navigate this experience as a Black man, a Black father, a Black academician, a Black community member, a Black son. I'm playing with all these intersectionalities in my identities, and the only place where I really have comfort is within my community, which is when you go back to Du Bois' research on the souls of Black folk. I'm constantly playing behind this veil. And I have this dual personality that in constant conflict because I'm not fully embraced or accepted in this society. And where I am accepted in my community, I'm still questioned on whether or not I co-opted or I sold out to be in the space that I'm in right now to connect with, trying to eradicate some of the wrongs in our society.
If our companies figure out how to do inclusive hiring and how to manage inclusive teams, when we support Black businesses, when we support Black entrepreneurs, when we have a tech startup system that embraces the Latinx and Black community, where they make up 28% of our nation's population, but only 2% of the venture capital in the entire country, we will get a more prosperous America. America has this incredible opportunity in the 21st century to be a place where everyone on the globe, no matter your color, no matter your religion, no matter your background, can participate. And when we build in that participation, we know that we get more diverse results.
And the way racism works, and among other things, it's not just about, how we use resources and who gets what. It is, where do we put toxic waste? Where do we test atomic bombs? Where do we strip resources? Where do we poison the air and the soil and the water? Okay? And that sounds really good. We can do it in places where these powerless people live. Except that we live on the same planet. And if I do it in a place I can't see on the planet, it still is going to impact me exactly where I am. And so we're in this midst of global climate change, and there's an interdependence right now that if we work collectively, maybe we can begin turning this thing around.
If I'm going to have this kind of conversation and this type of friendship, then maybe it'll be important to have it in, with these players, right? Maybe I need to have more prosecutor friends. Maybe I need to have more police friends, right? And develop those relationships with this idea that we can do something. I think that's where it needs to go. People from those positions need to just start having those conversations.
I don't think there are enough opportunities and moments, and I think we need to create more opportunities and moments for people to get outside of their bubbles, get a little uncomfortable, interact with people that are different from them, hear other people's lived experience, and listen. And what happens through that is you build empathy. And we know that people are more likely to dispel their own stereotypes or biases when they know someone of a different race or of a different sexual orientation or a different gender or a different religion.
I think there's a lot we can do as individuals and as just members of larger society to enhance racial understanding. My go-to is always education, is continue to be educated. If you think you know everything about a community, even if it's your own, think again. Read more books, find different perspectives, find perspectives and narratives that don't always agree with what you're saying. Like with the Arab American community, for example, we come from 22 different countries. So as an Arab American myself, somebody whose family's from Lebanon, I cannot say that I know the people of, Egypt perfectly well, or Morocco, or this country or that country. So I'm always trying to educate myself on my community, let alone other communities. So I think education and finding multiple sources and making sure that the sources you're looking at are factual and are coming from a legit source.
And then I think from an academic perspective, we need to hire more Black scholars. and to tenure track positions, not just in a position, but in a position where they're regarded and guarded and supported, so they can get the literature out. Because unfortunately, when we look at a lot of the race-related literature that's being lifted up in research, they don't look like me. And it becomes valid when somebody outside the culture says that it's something that we should investigate. But I believe that there's a need for the academy to embrace the literature that comes from Black people, from Latinos, from the Arab Chaldean community.
And I'm not going to quiet down. I'm not going to tell the world why I can't talk about this because I run a 501c3. Nah, we got to deal with this right now, because I don't want my boy to become the same kind of victim of race. I want him to be a benefactor of culture, and I want him to live a culturally stimulated, fulfilled life where he can interact and develop beautiful relationships with all kinds of people as a Black man, and with full respect to his Africanity, his story, his heritage. And I want him to be able to make a contribution to society from that position. So in order for him to do it, Dad's got to model that. And that's what I'm doing now. So it's a liberating time.
And I'm opening up a youth-driven community center. And I'm hoping and I'm leading towards having it be a healing house.
The last level I go to is the home. You know, we've got to have some uncomfortable moments and conversations within our families, because many of us are in love with families that have held on to false notions for generations, and in some cases have perpetuated them. The fall of a nation begins in the home. That African proverb has never rang more true than it does in this society. And the edification of a nation also begins in the home. So we've got to, you know, you may have to challenge some folks in the family about their notions, and you may have to rebel, you know, to reestablish some value systems. But at the end of it, if you can get people in your household to realize everyone's humanity, then you've done a good thing.
On a personal level, it's connections. That is sort of building on that internal list of contacts and being able to say, yeah, I know that person. He is or she is an activist in the X community, whatever it is, Arab, African American, Asian American, Latino, whatever. Being able to make those connections that were gained from the programs at New Detroit, and being able to, you know, tap them on the shoulder and say, you know, can you help me out with this? Because ultimately we're all engaged in coalition building, like New Detroit is. And so it's really the personal connections that sort of last.
Hey, listen, there's this opportunity via my own personal self-improvement to help build community, to build trust, to build a willingness to engage. And if that's with someone that looks like me, or that's with a legitimate ally and advocate that belongs to another community, bet. What up, though? Let's do this. You know what I'm saying? Let's do this.
Well, the 4 words. 5. I absolutely love being black. This is the dopest thing God gave me.
I think to enhance racial understanding, we have to have a dialogue. We have to have a conversation between different groups of people to explore how we're different, but also how we have things in common, because that's so important. I think that, America is a patchwork of different sub-communities, and we have to sort of define and redefine what it is to be an American, and to find those common grounds that define us as a country.
If you're not willing to acknowledge and name a problem, then you can't address it. And we need to acknowledge and name the fact that we have a race problem in America. And it goes back to the founding of this country and the way indigenous people were treated, an economic system built on the exploitation of people and enslavement of black people. And while there's been progress over the last 400 years, the symptoms of that continue to manifest themselves. And we need to be okay with naming that and calling it, because you can't start to address a problem unless you're willing to admit and acknowledge that one exists.
For me, it's a personal mission just to help educate people and to help create an atmosphere of education and learning.
There's a lot of tension in the country, and the tension exists because we've not taken the time to sit down at the table and get to know each other. So I think the other part is actually sitting down with each other, having these conversations, and knowing that there's no solution today, but we can work towards that solution. Because I think everybody's looking for the silver bullet, but I started the conversation out with 401 years. You can't change a system of 401 years of racialized oppression in one setting. It's an ongoing journey. And then I think from an academic perspective, we need to hire more black scholars.
I think it's been hidden a lot, and I think talking about it is going to help us to really start admitting it, dealing with it straight on, and actually starting to find mechanisms to start healing so that we can come together.
How can we recognize behaviors that create systemic inequities? And a lot of times we don't have the answers. A lot of times, even though we're well-intentioned and we'd like to say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, or I'm not a racist, we are the product of this America in which we were created, in which we were raised, and in which we've prospered. And this society has perpetuated systems based on religion and based on race, based on wealth, that create these systemic barriers in all kinds of ways. And they're perpetuated everywhere.
We're having those discussions. We're having how come immigrants own stores in the own stores in the city, but don't hire people from the neighborhood, and what does that look like, and what's that conflict? But when we go to have that conversation with the majority, that conversation is just, well, I'm not doing nothing wrong, or there's, the law doesn't say anything. The law is fine, and I just wash my hands of it, right? On a personal level, that's just a conversation that I think people don't have, that are, people from the majority don't have a chance to have, because they're never having to confront that kind of reality. They're just kind of get to exist as themselves, and they're never having to think about what it will look like or what that impact will be long-term down the road.
In the grand scheme of things, so much of it is just the capacity to live as a full human being. And yet somehow that becomes privilege by virtue of other people being treated as less than human on the basis of the way in which we stratify these ideas of who and what we are.
I'd like to believe that we are at a time when change is possible, where we have an opportunity to come together, to look at the need to share power, look at the need to address global climate change and work collectively across racial categories. And it's important to not get so discouraged, to believe that nothing can ever be better.
When I think about resiliency and pride, growing up in a post-civil rights experience in Detroit, being black was something that you were supposed to be. You had Dudley Randall and you had the Broadside Press, which brought in black literature to the classroom. So to be a part of an experience where you heard Young, Gifted, and Black from Nina Simone being a song that was a part of your experience, or being able to sing the Negro National Anthem at various events and activities in our PK-12 experience. So there were moments where being black was reinforced from a broader context inside of the PK-12 experience. But again, there were these moments where that same experience was squashed by individuals. But when it was squashed, there was my mother, my grandmother, who constantly reminded me of who I was and what my mission in life was, constantly reinforcing that it's nobody like you, and you have to step out, step up, and be on guard at all times. So that message was promoted in the house. And then my father, being a union person working at Ford Motor Company, Dearborn Stamping Plant, didn't want me to work in the auto industry on the assembly line, wanted more for me, and told me that I can do more, and told me that, you know, you got to walk a certain way, you have to operate a certain way, you have to look a certain way, but that's okay, because when you continue to go down this path, you'll be in a better position than a lot of us, because we have to learn how to operate in two spaces sometimes. Father said you need street sense, common sense, book sense, and my mother said you need spiritual sense. So when I took all of those things into play, along with what I learned from my mentors, like a Reverend Dr. Percy Licardo Moore, who I met at Wayne State University when I started as an undergrad. This was a black man who was dignified, refined, and when you walked in his office, you saw this beautiful artwork, and you saw this guy wearing a three-piece suit with cap-toe shoes, a cravat tie, and always just very well regarded within the academic community. I'm like, I want to be like him.
My mother is from Panama. My descendants hail from Jamaica and Barbados. My mother's family endured similar limitations, social limitations that African Americans in the South endured during the Jim Crow era and during Reconstruction in America, living in the Canal Zone. My mother had to learn her native language. She grew up in the Canal Zone, and English was her first language. She had to learn Spanish. And the Canal Zone instituted controls very similar to what African Americans experienced in the South. But I never get an opportunity to talk about this beautiful explosion that happens when I combine that African and West Indian ancestry and how bountiful and colorful and multilingual and beautiful it is. You know, I still have cousins in Panama who I communicate with, and we're on Zoom, and you know, I'm always grounded by that, you know. But then I hit the streets in Detroit, and I don't get to discuss that because everybody is black or white, and I'm like, y'all are missing all this over here, you know. My dad's family, you know, has a southern migration story that runs through parts of Mississippi and parts of Alabama, and you know, I'm pretty sure there's stories about Green Book transport and travails that they've survived, and we never get to talk about that because we start and stop at black and white.
For example, 4 brown dudes walk into a Waffle House in Tennessee at 3 a.m. We walk in, the entire counter turns around and just stares at us for 30 minutes. And so we're there. I'm 14 at the time. We got some friends all the way from like 19 to 14. We're on our way to Atlanta. And we have to decide, do we stay or do we go? And is this stare a stare of concern, an inquiry, or is this a stare of hostility? And so we're there. And then we're finally like, hey, do we just grab a seat? Even though the sign said, please wait. They're like, yeah, just go ahead, grab a seat. And again, took 10, 20 minutes to get the menu. Another 10, 20 minutes for the food to come. And the whole time, everybody at the counter is just looking at us. Dead silence kind of place. Like what was loud and boisterous truck stop, Waffle House was now quiet. And so we're there and we're having this debate as we're eating the breakfast. We're debating whether to leave a good tip. And so we're like, well, if we were purely American, if we thought of ourselves as purely American, we would not leave a tip or leave a bad tip because we were got very bad service. But if we're the first ones here, first time they've ever seen us, and this is gonna be their experience with respect to seeing people that look like us, then we better be generous. And that was the debate over the 45 minutes that we were eating, is which one are we? And so on a personal level, that's just a conversation that I think people don't have, that are, people from the majority don't have a chance to have, because they're never having to confront that kind of reality. They're just kind of get to exist as themselves, and they're never having to think about like what it will look like or what that impact will be long term down the road. And so that's for me personally.
I really experienced racism in my own neighborhood, which I lived for 20 to 22 years, where people would ask me, did I speak English? And, what was I? What are you? In the grocery stores. And I would ask the people, well, what are you? And they would say, no, where do you come from? And never had I really had never experienced that, or I was not awoke. Maybe I was experiencing it, but because I'm so positive, I just kind of blew it off, and I have enough self-esteem about myself. But because of the last 4 or 5 years and our political climate, I really, people were bold enough to ask me those questions while I'm standing in the line, at my local grocery store. Like, do I speak English? Where do I come from? What am I? And so to me, it just hurt my heart, and the old me would have, been all over that. I'm from Detroit, Southwest Detroit, but the new me just kind of ate it and sucked it up. But I got in my car and I had tears in my eyes, because I'm in my late 50s. I'm 61 right now, so that was happening in my late 50s. And I realized, how people look at us. They look at Mexicans, or they look at somebody that's dark with dark hair, dark eyes, in a dominantly affluent white neighborhood. And had they always been looking at me that way? And had they always been saying that? And I wasn't awoke. And because of the last 4 years, I've learned a lot about racism, and how it's really been there. But this last administration seems to have ignited people to have the guts to ask me questions like that, And so, yeah, to me, that hurted a lot, to be able to just think that I'm American. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and, and I'm educated, and yet for somebody to ask me, what am I, it's like, it's very hurtful. And I want to be part of changing that.
Again, it's the 80s. Everybody wanted to see, the Louis Vuitton department and Gucci and, all of the brands that, hip hop magnified within urban communities. And a flock of service people met us at the top of the elevator. All white. And that's probably the earliest experience I had with this idea of being profiled. And I think maybe one of the students made purchases, but many of them left. They're like, if you're gonna follow me around the store, then there's really no point in me spending money here, which I thought, which also sort of keyed me into what was actually happening in that moment. And then there's another, and I think that one of the challenges with thinking about race and talking about race is that sometimes it's subtle, or maybe not so subtle, but I remember interning on Capitol Hill, and I made the decision. I couldn't exactly tell you why now. I won't mention how many years ago that was, but it was, a lot of them. I made the decision to intern with a conservative lobbying group. And I think it was probably mostly because it was a lobbying group on Capitol Hill, and it was going to be this fantastic opportunity, and I wouldn't have to write politically. I would be doing research, and I would be going to meetings and taking notes. So, these were sort of politically neutral activities where I could really learn what lobbying was and have this, what I thought would be a pretty great experience. Now, one, I'm the only person of color, not an Asian American, Latin American person, mixed race person, nobody. I am the brown in the room. And the director, the president and CEO of the group, invited everyone to like an annual summer engagement in his backyard in Georgetown. And I took the metro, and I got there, and me, because it's the 90s now, and I've got my little Senegalese twist, and I'm pretty sure I literally had on a mud cloth vest. And I am still the only brown face in the entire space. And my immediate supervisor, who was great to me, I didn't have a single negative experience while working for the lobbying group. But she sort of ushers me over and to introduce me to her husband. And at this point, I'm observing because I don't know anyone in the space, which is why I think she sort of realized that I was uncomfortable and wanted to sort of engage me. And so at this point, I'd watched him shake everyone's hand that he'd encountered. And when he came to me, he wouldn't shake my hand. He wouldn't touch me. And I watched her face go ashen at the idea. Yet he was still her husband. And I remember not staying much longer after that. But as I was walking back towards the metro, asking myself, is that what I thought it was? I think that's what I thought it was. Was there anybody else he didn't touch? And ultimately coming to the conclusion that, especially based on her reaction as well, that was obvious. And fortunately, I was rooted enough that that didn't shift the way that I thought about myself. But the idea that it didn't affect me, well, of course it did.
For me, it's a personal mission just to help educate people and to help create an atmosphere of education and learning. And I guess also on more specifically for me as somebody who's kind of this brownish but not quite brownish person, there's a lot of question marks about who I am and my racial and ethnic identity. And as an Arab American, it's really important for me to tell my own story and to, again, give traits and talk about our ethnicity, our culture, and kind of who we are. So again, kind of, I guess, dispelling stereotypes about me personally, but then also this moral and social responsibility to do that with other ethnic and racial groups. A really big stereotype is that all Arabs are Muslim, right? That Muslim equals Arab and Arab equals Muslim. And that's another thing that we really, in my personal and professional life, that I really try to kind of quell. If you look at the religious makeup of the Arab American community, it's split. It's about 50% who are Muslim and 50% who are Christian. So, and there should be a little asterisk by that number, right? Because there's also Arabs who are Jewish, Arabs who practice numerous religions outside of those major monotheistic religions, and then Arabs who are also atheist and agnostic. And so, yeah, you can't use religion as a way to define the Arab and Arab American community because it's really rich, even overseas in the Arab countries. I guess the biggest stereotype would be that I hear a lot of the time, I guess, is that Arab Americans are just inherently violent or angry or hate this group, hate that group, don't respect women, don't respect other religious communities. So I think the biggest stereotype would be just that Arab people and Arab Americans are not tolerant or are sexist or homophobic or racist or whatever. And of course, you have small elements of that in the community, just like you have in every community, but that's not what defines the community. And so that's something that I really try actively to help educate people about. It's that no, it's not that Arab Americans are inherently this, that, or the other. It's just that somebody will take one story and they'll smear it for an entire group of people. And we see that with other groups too. So that's, I guess, my one big fire that I try to put out.
I lecture on Asian American history at the University of Michigan. And so we teach to the students the whole Asian American experience from the beginning to end, from the gold rush and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad through the exclusionary acts, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Asian Barred Zone Act of 1917 that stopped immigration from Asia in 1917, and that was repeated in the Immigration Act of 1924. That wasn't repealed until 1943. That's part of the story about how immigration policy has affected the Asian American presence in the United States. We also touch upon hate crimes, the othering of the population, the Vincent Chin case, and now we've actually talked about all the incidents that have occurred against the Asian American community during the COVID pandemic. It's a target community right now, and we all have our personal ways of coping with what we perceive is that atmosphere that's going on right now, whether it's wearing something that is not, provocative in a racial or ethnic sense, trying to wear things that identify you as part of the community, and also looking out for one another and talking with people in the community in terms of their anxieties, what they're coping with in terms of as we gradually return to a post-pandemic situation. Are they going to resume their lives like before the pandemic, or are they going to have to make adjustments? And that's an ongoing conversation with so many people in the community. Data shows that probably 3 out of 4 Asian Americans experience microaggressions and acts of discrimination, whether it's being seated in a restaurant in a closed section and not being served by the wait staff for 20 minutes and then asking the wait staff, well, why did you put me in a closed section? They laughed. That's an example of being singled out, othered. Other experiences like my being in elementary school and pulled out of a kickball circle and blamed for the Korean War. Other people have probably been subject to that as a result of a different war, the Vietnam War, or other wars. A lot of them have been in Asia, and so different Asian American populations have been victimized and othered because of those different theaters of war over time. I think the different communities can contribute to the cultural experiences that is truly American. And so that, I think, is part of the contribution. The Asian American population is very diverse, coming from perhaps 40 heritage countries. And so there's no commonality in terms of common language, common foods, common dress, that sort of thing, or common experiences. Not even a common diaspora coming from so many different countries to the United States. That can all contribute to the richness of the American experience.
Growing up, as a black woman in Detroit, I loved being black. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. I was born in 1963 and graduated from high school in 1981. And in 1974, Coleman Young became mayor of Detroit, and I was 11 years old at that time. And we knew nothing but black pride in the city of Detroit. I loved being a black person. I was also conscious, even as a child, of colorism. And it showed up because people would make a comment about me being light-skinned, yellow banana, and there was sometimes this feeling of wanting to belong more fully to blackness, not always having to prove my blackness and my sense of belonging. And when I got pregnant with my first child, her father was a very handsome, brown-skinned man, and I thought maybe now my child won't have to prove what I've had to prove. I'll have a beautiful brown-skinned girl. And I did. And she's beautiful and she's brown-skinned. But what I had not anticipated was that people would somehow, through colorism, not see me as fully her mother and not see her as fully my daughter. And that we'd have to deal with not just racism, but also colorism within my family, within the community, and that I would be able to incompletely support my daughter as she was dealing with a lot of the abuses that she had to deal with as a child. It's very hurtful to a child to have people question, is that really your mother? Is that really your sister? How come you don't look like them? And to treat them as if they don't belong to you. And so I think that for me, what that made me more conscious of is a need to, they talk about decolonizing your thinking, and to be more conscious and also accountable for any thinking that was colorist, and to be more embracing of some of the challenges other people face that I don't. And I think one of the challenges is, yes, we're all black, but there's a pretense that we all experience black the same way. We don't. My daughter's highly educated. She's a brilliant woman, and she's beautiful, and she's going to be treated differently than a young person who is not. She speaks English in the way that is respected in our society, and there are people who speak Black vernacular English, what we call Ebonics, and they're treated differently. Not because they're not as intelligent, but because the language, their subculture, how they have learned to speak is looked at as being subordinate to other people. And that's where when you look at the whole concept of caste as opposed to race, that you have caste and you have race and it's all intersecting. And so, I think that for me now, I am just much more, thoughtful about what it means to be black. That I can't just be proud of being a proud black woman who has had some of the privileges I've had. I have to own some of the other aspects of blackness and be somebody who's willing to fight on behalf of people who are different from me, and to also understand that I'm not the smartest person in the room because I have privilege, that I'm not more capable than a lot of people, and I've got to learn how to share power and share the spotlight sometimes with people who, in my work, I'm in community development, and so it's very easy for people to listen to me sometimes and see me as a leader. Sometimes I have to be willing to figure out how to assist people who have not had the privilege of the education and some of the opportunities I've had to also have their leadership recognized. They are leaders, and they're doing great things where they are, but they're not always seen in that way. And so another part of that struggle is sort of building community and being part of and not always in front of the process.
I identify with my family's immigration experience as Jews who fled persecution in Europe and came to America looking for freedom and opportunity, and they really had that. And to think about my grandfather coming here with no education and working with his hands, and having come from a part of Poland that only a few decades after he left, his family members and my grandmother's siblings and parents were killed in Nazi concentration camps, and to come to America, and I had not only the privilege of going to Cranbrook and going to great universities and all that, but to be the House Majority Floor Leader, the second ranking position in the Michigan House. That is a uniquely American experience of the kind of Horatio Alger, rags to riches type story that is something that is a part of the American ethos. What we also know is at the same time for people of color, That's not been as much the experience. It's been quite the opposite. We're sitting in New Detroit's office, which was created in 1967. I was born only 3 years later here in Detroit in 1970. And when you really think about what has been done for civil rights in the last 51 years in my lifetime, we really haven't moved that far. When you see something like the George Floyd murder, when you listen to sometimes how the former president talked about the city of Detroit, how folks have talked about our voting process here to suggest that it was fraudulent when it was statistically, our ballot boxes matched the results more than Livonia, and yet we're the poster child of fraud. To not be able to talk about and understand the kind of racism underlying such a comment, and to have that repeated by tens of millions of Americans as if there's a truth there, suggests that we've got so far to go. And only through kind of experience and communication will we get there. I remember when I was in the legislature, I represented the city of Detroit, and my first term there were 11 state reps whose primary districts were the city of Detroit, and I was the only white member of the Detroit delegation. And 5 of us, because of term limits, 5 of us were elected in our first terms at the same time. And the 5 of us sat together on the House floor in 2 rows behind each other. And after about the second or third month of being a new legislator, did it really hit me. And then it just hit me so hard for the next 2 years that every time a member of the legislature came to talk to the 5 of us to talk about Detroit, they only looked at me. They never looked at my 4 African-American colleagues, never could make a single eye contact. Once I started to recognize it after, I don't know how many times that happened in the first couple of months, but one day that realization happened. And then you start to realize it happens every single time that a legislator comes over there to say, hey, Detroit, I want to talk to you about an issue. I want to get your votes. I want to get your support. Coming there with good purpose, with genuine, sort of friendship and out, but just the comfort level, the sort of systemic racism in which they were raised, that we're all wearing suits, we're all professionals, we've all been elected by 95,000 people. In fact, if anything, I'm looking different from my constituents, and I'm sort of the guy who, has the least claim to the seat that I hold, and yet I'm the person that they talk to. Recognizing how prevalent that is. It's one thing when you could say, oh, that happened once, but once you noticed it, it was just the smallest inkling of me as a white male to experience how different the world could be if my skin color were different.
I've been a victim of police brutality twice in my life. And the thing that people may not understand is that a lot of black men have been victims of police brutality. So to watch it happen on a captured video, unedited, uninterrupted, took me back to when it happened to me. That feeling is visceral. I'm 50 years old, and I still remember the pain and the moment-by-moment occurrence that occurred when I was a freshman in college, and again when I was 1 year out of college, having graduated. So you're talking about upwards of 30 years of memories, and I have not forgotten one moment. And that's how it feels. It feels very, very present, very threatening. And it makes me realize how debilitating it is on a macro level, on a societal level, and how counterproductive it becomes when, as boys, young adults, and mature men, we have to still stop and contend with this thing every now and then. And then we know that when the hot time passes and we kind of go back to normalcy, the world is going to ask us to fall back into a state of compliance and temper our rhetoric and temper our behavior and temper our philosophies and our politics around this issue to make non-black people comfortable. Well, that's just not fair, because I haven't healed. So when do I get to heal? And that's how it made me feel. When does Kyrie, the husband, the father, the leader, and the citizen get a chance to just heal and move on and put this thing where in its proper place, where it really belongs?
So how does race play into my identity? How do others perceive me because of my race? What privileges or disadvantages might I have in this world because of my race? And doing that inner work to understand how race shapes you and the way that you are perceived and interact in this world. The second is how race plays into sort of your immediate surroundings. In your family, how does race affect your family dynamics? Or at the workplace, what does it mean to be a white person in a place of employment versus a person of color, and what opportunities or lack of opportunities might come with that? And when you can understand the internal aspect of race and your own identity, and then how it shows up in the world immediately around you, then you can start to understand how race permeates our systems throughout our country. The role that race plays in things like our criminal justice system, or our healthcare industry, or our education system. And you can start to understand the systemic nature of race and racism. I honestly think it's been a series of learning. Just when I think I understand, I've got my arms around it, I realize that there's more work that I need to do to really understand systems of inequity and race, and how my own experience as a white man can be totally different from someone who looks different from me in this world. I think this past year, I think I understood the disparity in our health systems, and that cut across lines of race. I think COVID has really laid bare just how deep those inequities ran. Seeing my city, Detroit, and the number of deaths and the disproportionate infection rates and deaths amongst the African American population was something that I think I understood intellectually, but I felt it over this past year. And it was just another example of something that kind of grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me and said, we need to address this, we need to work on this, this isn't right. And then again, this past spring with the more killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and the killings of black men and women, just the alarm is getting louder and louder that is telling us as a country that these aren't isolated incidents that pop up every few years and we spend a month or two talking about them and then we've addressed the issue of race in our country. It's the alarm bell is getting louder and louder to tell everyone to wake up and deal with this, not on a one-off basis, but in a deep, systemic, long-term way.
It's not that I'm offended by the term black. I just think that is a part of the shift that our society needs to make, so that we realize that every single individual you look at or talk to or shake hands with or give a pound to while we're in this pandemic has a deep story that is probably worthy of a book to itself. If we can get to that point, then naturally we're going to move beyond some of these prejudices that we exercise on a day-to-day basis. This race thing, it just binds us all. It binds the oppressed, it binds the oppressor. I need you to see more of me, and then if you're the one who lives this life of privilege, you don't want to deal with it. You don't want to talk with it because of what it may expose in you. And that's part of that ugliness that we need to push through and get past so we can get to the more beautiful discussions.